The train from Oxford was 40 minutes late, which gave Miss Marple adequate time to observe, through the window of the waiting room at Whitbourne Ferrers' halt, that the station master kept a small pot of cyclamen on his desk that had not been watered in at least a fortnight, that the young man pacing the platform had checked his watch 11 times in 20 minutes, and was therefore not waiting for a train but for a person, and that the woman reading a magazine on the bench opposite had read the same page 4 times without turning it. Miss Marple found railway stations, on the whole, instructive. Constance Fellows was waiting in her old rover at the station entrance, scarved and gloved, and faintly apologetic about the car's heater, which produced a smell of burned dust and very little warmth. She was a comfortable woman, Constance, the kind who filled a room without crowding it, who remembered that you took your tea without sugar, who had the particular quality of widowhood that is not sadness exactly, but a permanent slight adjustment, as though she had rearranged the furniture of herself to account for an absence, and had grown used to the new arrangement. "You'll find it very quiet," Constance said, as the rover moved through the village's single high street. "A post office, a pub called the Ferrers Arms, a butcher's with a hand-lettered Christmas card in the window, though perhaps not as quiet as I'd hoped for you. There's been a small complication." Miss Marple, who had learned over many decades that Constance's small complications were worth attending to, asked what sort. "Dorothea Calverton's niece has arrived, Harriet Voss. Her husband's with her." Constance negotiated a narrow bend with the confidence of long practice. "She came on the 23rd. Dorothea wasn't expecting her until the 25th, if at all. There's a solicitor's letter involved somewhere, though nobody's been told the particulars." "What is Mrs. Voss like?" Constance considered this for a moment in the way she considered most things, honestly, without rushing toward a conclusion. "Patient," she said. "Very patient. Her mother was the same. Eleanor Voss, Dorothea's younger sister. You know, they haven't spoken in 30 years, or hadn't. A falling out over the estate when old Mr. Calverton died. Eleanor kept a very beautiful garden in her day, I'm told. Harriet's the same. She does something remarkable with tall plants. Delphiniums, monkshood, things that need time and attention." The cottage sat at the far end of a farm track off the Hall's main drive, small and stone-built and smelling pleasantly of wood smoke. Constance had put spruce branches on the mantelpiece and a candle in each window, which gave the rooms the quality of a house that was genuinely glad to have someone in it. Miss Marple unpacked her 2 cases with the systematic efficiency she brought to all practical matters, hung her good grey cardigan behind the bedroom door, and accepted the cup of tea that was already waiting by the time she came downstairs. Through the cottage window the hall was visible at the end of its drive. Not a grand house, but a substantial one, the kind that had been added to in several different periods by people with different ideas about what was necessary, so that it presented to the world an amiable architectural argument. The grounds were frost-pale and bare. A single light burned in an upstairs window. "She holds a gathering every Christmas night," Constance said, following her gaze. "Dorothea! The whole village comes, more or less. It's been going on since 1993. She serves the same things every year, which people find either reassuring or tedious depending on their nature. The trifle is rather famous, actually. Ruth Callow makes it. She's been Dorothea's household manager for 20 years. People have been known to come purely on account of the trifle. What sort of woman is Mrs. Calverton?" "The sort," Constance said carefully, "who does a great deal for people and makes very sure that everyone knows it, without ever appearing to make sure. She held the estate together after Gerald died. Helped the Finch family when they were having trouble with the tenancy. Put in a word at the church when they were looking for a new organist. That sort of thing. People are very fond of her." She paused. "I am fond of her," she added in a tone that suggested the sentence had originally contained a qualifying clause that she had decided to remove. Miss Marple said nothing, which was frequently more useful than saying something. The Christmas gathering began at 7. Constance and Miss Marple walked the drive at 10 past, the gravel loud under their feet in the cold and still air, their breath visible. The hall's front door stood open, and warm light came through it in a rectangle across the frost-stiffened grass, and there was a sound of voices and faintly a radio playing something orchestral in a distant room. Dorothea Calverton received them in the entrance hall, with the particular ease of a woman who has never had occasion to wonder whether she belongs where she is. She was tall, still handsome, dressed in dark green wool, and she took Miss Marple's hand in both of hers, and said she was so pleased Constance had brought a friend, which was precisely the right thing to say, and was said in precisely the right way. And Miss Marple noted both facts and what they implied about the degree of practice involved. The drawing-room was warm and well lit, and crowded in the comfortable way of a house that has hosted the same gathering many times and knows how to arrange itself for the purpose. Miss Marple accepted a small glass of sherry and stood near the window and looked at the room with the mild, unfocused expression that she had found, over a long life, to be the most efficient instrument of observation. The Trifle sat at the center of the table on a silver stand that had been in the Calverton family longer than anyone alive could verify. Harriet Voss stood at the far end of the room, a glass in her hand, talking to no one. She was looking at the Trifle in the way that a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a very long time. Miss Marple took a sip of her sherry. She looked at Harriet Voss. Then she looked away. She had, she thought, a few things to consider. The gathering had the rhythm of a thing long rehearsed. People moved through the rooms in patterns that suggested they had done so many times before. The men gravitating toward the fire in the drawing-room, the women circulating more widely, the younger ones finding their way eventually to the kitchen passage where Ruth Callow could be heard moving between surfaces with the particular efficiency of a woman who resents assistance but will not say so directly. Miss Marple circulated. She had developed over many years a technique for social occasions that required observation. She found a spot, she stayed in it longer than was strictly comfortable, and she allowed people to come to her. People always did. There was something about a small, elderly woman standing quietly with a glass of sherry that invited confidence, as though her very stillness created a kind of recess in the social architecture into which people naturally stepped. She had never quite decided whether this was useful or melancholy, but she had long since stopped questioning it. Philip Calverton was the first to approach her. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the look of someone who had been athletic in his 30s and resented the decade since. He asked where she was visiting from, how long she was staying, whether she found Whitbourne Ferrers very changed from what she might have expected. A sequence of questions that performed interest without requiring him to listen carefully to the answers. Miss Marple answered them pleasantly and watched him scan the room twice during the 3 minutes they spoke, each time his gaze settling briefly on his mother before moving on. The second time, something crossed his face that was not quite guilt and not quite relief. It was the expression, Miss Marple thought, of a man who has a plan and is checking repeatedly whether the conditions for it still hold. Agnes Calverton came to collect her husband with the smooth social mechanics of a woman who has done it many times and learned to make it look like coincidence. She was smaller than Philip, dark-haired, with a quality of contained alertness that Miss Marple found more interesting than anything her husband had offered. She apologized for him without apologizing, said only that she wanted to introduce him to the Finches before they left early, and steered him away with a hand briefly at his elbow. And for just a moment before her expression resettled, she looked at Miss Marple with the appraising directness of someone who was also, in her own way, watching. Dr. Featherstone came and went twice, carrying his glass with the deliberateness of a man who was being careful about how much he drank, which generally indicated that he wanted to drink more. He spoke to Dorothea twice, once briefly at the edge of a larger conversation, and once near 8:30 in a quieter exchange near the door to the study, during which Dorothea touched his arm once, and he nodded in a manner that suggested he was being reassured about something he had not quite believed. He had a doctor's face, trained into neutrality, but with something tonight that the training did not fully cover. It was during the second of these exchanges that Miss Marple noticed Harriet Voss approach Dr. Featherstone from the other side of the room. She watched Harriet wait, precisely without impatience, for Dorothea to move away. Then she stepped in beside Featherstone with the ease of someone who had been planning the approach and had timed it correctly. Miss Marple was 12 feet away, and the room was noisy, and she could not hear what was said. She saw Featherstone's expression shift from social into something more considered, the look of a man thinking about a question, not simply receiving it. He spoke for perhaps 45 seconds. Harriet nodded, thanked him with a small smile, and moved on toward the table. Miss Marple watched Harriet cross the room. She would ask Featherstone later, she thought. She would remember to ask him what they had spoken about. At 9 o'clock, Ruth Callow appeared in the doorway and announced, in the manner of someone making an ecclesiastical pronouncement, that the trifle was ready. There was a sound in the room, not quite applause, but the anticipatory murmur of an audience that knew its cue, and people moved toward the table with the particular willingness of those obeying a ritual they have internalized. So completely they no longer notice they are obeying it. The trifle occupied its silver stand with the authority of an object that has been the center of this specific event for 31 years and knows it. Dorothea served it herself. This, apparently, was also part of the ritual. Ruth stood at her shoulder with a cloth and removed each plate as it was filled and passed it down the table, and people accepted them with genuine pleasure. And the room became for a few minutes the thing it appeared to be, a house full of neighbors enjoying Christmas in the company of a woman who had provided it for them every year for 3 decades. Harriet stood to Dorothea's left and watched the cream being spooned. "It's exactly right," she said to Ruth pleasantly when her own plate arrived. "The cream! Not stiff enough to mask the sherry. That's the difficult thing to get right with a trifle." Ruth looked briefly surprised to be addressed with such specificity, then pleased. 22 years, she said, before I had it right." Harriet smiled and looked down at her plate. Miss Marple, receiving her own serving, heard this exchange from 2 places to the left, and ate her trifle, and thought that it was very good, and that Harriet Voss had spoken about the cream with the authority of someone who had considered, in some detail, exactly what it would carry. The evening proceeded. The radio was turned up briefly for something seasonal, and then turned down again. Edwin Voss stood near the window for a long time, watching his wife talk to Agnes Calverton, with an expression of mild approval. "Harriet is the most patient person I have ever met," he said to no one in particular, or rather to the space between himself and Philip Calverton, who was standing nearby, and made a non-committal sound in response. "When she decides something is going to happen," Edwin said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man describing a quality he has long admired, It happens." Philip moved away. Edwin continued to look at his wife. At 10:15, Dorothea Calverton set down her glass. She did it without ceremony, simply placed it on the table beside her, and put one hand briefly to the table's edge. Her face did not change, precisely, but something in it shifted, a small internal alteration that Miss Marple, watching from across the room, recognized before she had consciously identified what she was recognizing. Dr. Featherstone was at her side within moments. He had been watching her, Miss Marple realized, in the way that a doctor watches someone they have spoken to about something they are worried about. He took her arm. Dorothea said something quiet. Featherstone's expression, which had been carefully controlled all evening, became very still in the manner of a man suppressing urgency. Philip was there, and then Agnes, and then the room rearranged itself with the sudden, collective recalibration of people who understand that something is wrong. Ruth Callow stood in the doorway to the kitchen passage with a cloth in her hands, watching. Harriet Voss stood at the far side of the room, her plate still in one hand, and watched Dorothea Calverton fold slowly, with Featherstone's hands at her shoulders, toward the floor. She did not move forward. She did not look away. Her face held the particular composed stillness of a person who is not surprised, and who has already decided, in advance, exactly how they will stand when this moment comes. Miss Marple set down her own glass. Somewhere in the back of the house, the radio played on for 3 or 4 minutes before anyone thought to turn it off. By then the ambulance had been called, and people were standing in the hall and the passage and the doorways in the postures of those who have been returned, without preparation, from a social occasion to the actual world, and do not yet know what to do with their hands. Dorothea Calverton died before the ambulance reached the hall. The gathering did not so much end as cease. People found their coats. Ruth stood in the kitchen with her cloth and did not move for a very long time. Philip sat in his father's chair by the dead fire, and Agnes stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder and looked at nothing in particular. Miss Marple and Constance walked home along the drive in the dark, and the cold without speaking. The frost had come down harder while they were inside. Their footsteps on the gravel sounded very loud. At the cottage door, Constance said, "Her heart, I suppose." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. She went inside and sat by the wood-burner for a long time after Constance had gone to bed, and looked at the wall and thought about cream. The frost had not lifted by morning. It lay across the grounds of Whitbourne Hall and the cottage garden and the farm track with the permanence of something that had decided to stay. And the sky above it was the flat, ungiving white of a day that would not brighten. Miss Marple stood at the cottage kitchen window with her first cup of tea, and looked at it and found it appropriate. Constance came downstairs at 8:30 with the slightly diminished look of someone who had not slept well and had decided not to mention it. She made toast, and they ate it at the kitchen table without much conversation, which was, Miss Marple had always felt, the true test of a companionable household. Not the quality of the talk, but the quality of the silence. At 9 o'clock, Philip Calverton telephoned to tell Constance what she already knew, which was that his mother had died, and to add what she did not, which was that Dr. Featherstone had completed the death certificate listing acute cardiac arrest, and that the family were grateful for everyone's kindness, and that there would be no gathering today. Naturally. He said naturally twice. It was the word of a man constructing normalcy from available materials. "Poor Philip," Constance said, replacing the receiver. She said it with genuine feeling and without elaboration, which told Miss Marple that Constance's feelings about Philip were complicated enough that she had decided this morning to simplify them. They walked to the hall at 10. Constance had been going every Boxing Day for 11 years to help Ruth with the post-Christmas clearing, and she saw no reason, she said, to abandon Ruth today of all days. Miss Marple went with her, which required no particular justification beyond the fact that she was a guest, and guests may accompany their hosts, and which had the additional merit of being true. The whole felt different with the party gone from it. The drawing-room had been partially cleared, glasses collected, the table returned to its ordinary position. But the silver trifle stand was still in the center of it, unwashed, which struck Miss Marple as the detail that most accurately represented the state of the house. There are things one means to deal with and then does not. Ruth Callow was in the kitchen. She was washing the dishes from last night with the mechanical concentration of someone performing a task not because it needs doing, but because the hands require occupation. She was a stout, gray-haired woman with a plain face that was, this morning, simply exhausted, not performing grief, not arranging itself into appropriate expressions, simply exhausted in the way of someone who had sustained something through the night and found they had nothing left for the morning. Miss Marple observed this carefully. "I don't want help," Ruth said without turning around. "Thank you." "I know," said Constance, and sat down at the kitchen table anyway, and after a moment Ruth continued washing up. Miss Marple moved quietly through the kitchen and into the passage beyond on the pretext of finding somewhere to put her coat, which was not so much a deception as an omission. The passage ran along the back of the house to a small boot room and a secondary staircase, and the guest bedrooms were above. She was not yet going upstairs. She stood in the passage and listened to the house, which had the particular quality of a large building absorbing something it had not been asked to absorb before. She returned to the kitchen after a few minutes and accepted the cup of tea that Ruth had, despite herself, put on for her. Philip arrived at 10:30 with Agnes. He was wearing the clothes of a man who had not thought about what to wear, which was uncharacteristic. He had been, at last night's gathering, quite carefully put together. Agnes was in a dark jumper and had her hair pinned back in the functional way of someone who had already been managing things. She spoke to Ruth briefly about practical arrangements, deliveries expected, a prescription to be collected, and did it with a brisk competence that Miss Marple suspected was her natural register, revealed now that the social overlay had been temporarily suspended. Philip sat down and looked at the kitchen table. He said, "She was in very good health," Featherstone said. "It was unexpected." He said it as though testing the word to see whether it would hold the weight he needed from it. "Yes," said Constance. "Well," Philip looked up, "we'll have to see what comes next." He said this with a vagueness that was not quite grief and not quite calculation, and Agnes, across the room, looked at him briefly in a way that contained an entire private conversation. Harriet and Edwin Voss appeared at the kitchen door at 11. They had not, apparently, discussed whether to come. Harriet simply came, with Edwin behind her, and she said to Philip, with genuine directness, "I'm very sorry. Whatever was between her and my mother, I'm sorry for your loss." Philip received this with a nod that cost him some visible effort. Agnes watched Harriet with the attention of someone who had revised their assessment of a person and was still working out what the new assessment should be. Edwin stood in the doorway in his practical way and looked around the kitchen with the appraising steadiness of a surveyor. It was during this moment of general rearrangement, people finding places to stand, Agnes moving to the counter, Philip rubbing his face with one hand, that Miss Marple happened to be nearest the passage door, and Constance, who had stepped into the passage to retrieve her scarf, returned saying, "Harriet, I think you left your window open. There's a terrible draught at the top of the stairs. I noticed as I passed." "Oh," said Harriet without particular alarm, "I'll see to it." She went and came back in 4 minutes and said it was sorted. Miss Marple, who had noted that Constance had also mentioned, while passing back through, that the guest-room windowsill held what appeared to be a collection of small bottles. "Harriet seems to take a great many things for her health, Edwin. Don't you worry." Watched Edwin smile the smile of a man who regards his wife's habits as charming and foreign and none of his concern. "She swears by various tinctures," he said pleasantly. "I've stopped questioning it." Inspector Donald Croft arrived at 11:30. He was a compact man with the physical economy of someone who has learned not to occupy more space than necessary, and he had the kind of face that seemed designed to give nothing away while receiving everything. He was accompanied by a constable who wrote things down. He explained, with the careful courtesy of someone delivering information that will not, in the end, feel courteous, that a post-mortem had been ordered as a procedural matter. The GP's certificate would stand in all probability, he said. But there were forms, there were processes, there was the matter of the suddenness, and he was sure the family understood. Philip understood. Agnes understood more than she showed. Ruth, standing at the sink, went very still. Croft spoke to each of them in turn with the patient, slightly flattening attention of a man assembling a picture. He was polite to Miss Marple, which is to say he was politely dismissive, asking only how long she had been at the cottage, and whether she had noticed anything unusual during the gathering. Miss Marple said she had found it a very pleasant evening, right up until the end. Croft wrote nothing in response to this. When he spoke to Ruth, he was somewhat gentler than Miss Marple had expected. Ruth answered his questions with the halting carefulness of someone navigating a path they cannot quite see, confirming that she had made the trifle, that she had been in the kitchen for most of the afternoon preparing it, that no one else had. She paused there, briefly, and then said no one else had been significantly in the kitchen during the preparation. Significantly, Miss Marple noted. Ruth's hands, which had been still for most of the conversation, found the cloth on the counter and held it. Croft thanked her and moved on. After he had gone, the kitchen held the particular atmosphere of a room from which something has recently departed and left its shape behind. Philip went to the study. Agnes followed. Edwin suggested quietly to Harriet that they might give Ruth some privacy, and Harriet agreed, and they went upstairs. Constance began, without being asked, to dry the dishes that Ruth had left on the rack. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table and looked at Ruth Callow, who had turned back to the sink and was washing a bowl that was already clean. Her shoulders were held with a rigid, deliberate straightness, and her grief, Miss Marple was quite certain it was grief, not guilt, though she understood perfectly that they would look, from the outside, almost identical, came off her in the way that heat comes off stone after the sun has left it. Something that had been absorbed over a long time, releasing slowly. The kind of grief, Miss Marple thought, that belongs to someone who had served devotedly and been seen as furniture, and who had made their peace with it, and who was now discovering that the peace did not survive the loss of the thing it had been made with. She thought of Ruth's brief pause. No one else had been significantly in the kitchen. Someone had been in the kitchen. Not significantly. Just enough. She looked at the cleaned bowl on the rack, which Ruth was now washing again, and thought that it was very important to find out who had considered themselves insignificant. The result came on the 27th, at 10 in the morning, by telephone to Philip Calverton, who relayed it to Agnes, who was the one who actually understood what it meant before he had finished saying it. Aconitine. Present in the cream layer of the trifle in a quantity sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in an adult of Dorothea Calverton's age and constitution. The post-mortem had been unambiguous on the point, which was, the pathologist had apparently noted, somewhat unusual for aconitine, which was not a common choice and was not always identified without specific testing. The specific testing had been requested because the attending pathologist had found the cardiac presentation slightly irregular and was, professionally speaking, the kind of man who trusted slightly irregular. Philip sat in the study with this information for 20 minutes before Croft arrived. Agnes sat opposite him and said very little, which was the correct response and which she had arrived at without deliberation. Miss Marple heard it from Constance, who had it from Dr. Featherstone, who had been telephoned by Croft as a professional courtesy before the formal notification went to the family. Featherstone had then telephoned Constance, apparently because he needed to tell someone who was not involved, and Constance was the person he trusted for this particular function, he said. Constance reported that he felt he should have known. He said it twice. He's taking it very hard, Constance said. She and Miss Marple were in the cottage sitting room. Outside the window the frost had finally begun to yield, the lawn acquiring a patchy, grey dampness. He was fond of her, more than professionally, I've always thought, though nothing was ever. He's simply a man who was fond of someone and is now having to be a doctor about it, which isn't easy. No, said Miss Marple, it wouldn't be. She was thinking about Featherstone and Harriet Voss at the party. The 45-second conversation she had not been able to hear. She had meant to ask him. She had not asked him. She put this down as an error and made a note to correct it. Croft arrived at the hall at 11 and was there for 2 hours. Miss Marple and Constance walked up the drive at 12:30, which Constance justified as returning a dish she had borrowed from Ruth in October, which was true, and which provided an adequate reason for being on the premises without constituting a deception. The hall had changed again. It had the feeling now of a house that had accepted a new definition of itself and was reorganizing accordingly. 2 constables were in the kitchen. Ruth was sitting at the table, not washing up, with a cup of tea in front of her that had gone cold. Philip was in the study with Croft. Agnes was in the hall when they arrived, and she opened the door with the look of someone who had been managing the situation for 2 hours and had run out of ways to make it manageable. "Constance," she said, "thank you for coming." She looked at Miss Marple with the appraising directness of the previous morning, but sharper now, recalibrated. "Miss Marple, please come in." She took them to the sitting room rather than the kitchen, which told Miss Marple that the kitchen was where things were happening, and Agnes was keeping the periphery clear. Harriet and Edwin were already there. Harriet was in the chair by the window, composed, her hands folded in her lap, the legal pad on the side table beside her, suggesting she had been making notes that she had now set aside. Edwin was standing, because Edwin, Miss Marple had observed, always stood when he was uncomfortable and hadn't decided what to do about it. "They're saying poison," Agnes said without preamble when she had closed the door. "Croft has been very careful with his words, but it amounts to that," Harriet said. "Yes." Edwin looked at his wife. "They'll want to know about access to the kitchen," Harriet continued. Her voice had the quality of someone thinking aloud who has already completed the thinking. "Who prepared the food? Who was in the room? Whether anything was left unattended?" "Ruth prepared it," Agnes said. "She always prepares it." "Was she alone all afternoon?" Agnes looked at her. It was a brief look, but it had content. "I believe so. Mostly. Miss Marple looked at the legal pad on the side table. The top sheet had 2 lines of notes in small, neat handwriting which she could not read from the settee. Croft came into the sitting room at 1:10. He had the contained energy of a man who had formed a view and was now in the phase of constructing the architecture around it. He was courteous to everyone and asked each of them a variation of the same questions: where they had been during the afternoon preceding the gathering, whether they had entered the kitchen at any point, whether they had observed anyone else doing so. He asked Harriet whether she had been in the kitchen. Harriet said she had offered to help carry things at one point. Around 5:30, she thought, and had brought a dish through from the cold larder. "I've always found kitchens grounding," she added pleasantly. "I wanted to be useful without being underfoot." Croft wrote this down. He wrote it in the tone, if a physical action could be said to have a tone, of someone noting a fact rather than a detail, filing it as context rather than content. Miss Marple watched him do it. He turned to Miss Marple with the polite efficiency he had established as his register for her. She was a guest. She was elderly. She was not from Whitburn Ferrers, and she occupied in his assessment the category of peripheral witness. He asked whether she had observed anything during the gathering that had struck her as unusual. Miss Marple considered the question with the appearance of genuine effort. "I noticed," she said, "that the trifle was very good." Croft regarded her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Quite." He finished with them and went back to the study. Agnes watched him go with the expression of a woman totaling a column of figures that will not, however many times she adds them, produce a comfortable sum. Philip emerged from the study at 2:00. He had the look of a man who had been questioned for an hour and a half about matters that touched repeatedly and uncomfortably against something he was not being questioned about at all. He sat in his father's chair in the drawing-room and looked at the empty silver stand in the center of the table, which no one had yet put away, and Miss Marple, passing the doorway, saw his expression. Not grief, precisely, and not calculation, precisely, but something that existed in the specific unhappy territory between them, where a man discovers that an obstacle has been removed by someone else and finds that this does not produce the freedom he imagined, because the method of removal has made the whole question impossible. She paused at the doorway. Philip looked up. "Miss Marple," he said, with the social reflex of a man who has been well raised, "can I get you anything?" "No, thank you," she said. "I am very sorry about your mother." Philip received this with a nod that was genuine enough. Then he said, looking back at the silver stand, "She was going to say no to something I'd asked her. She hadn't said it yet, but she was going to." He said it in the manner of someone, thinking aloud, who has forgotten they have an audience. And then he stopped, having remembered. "It must be very difficult," Miss Marple said, "to manage an estate of this size." Philip looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." She left him there and went to find Agnes. Agnes was in the small room off the hall that had apparently served as a correspondence room in Gerald Calverton's day, and now held a desk, a filing cabinet, and the household's administrative life. She was standing at the filing cabinet with a folder open, not reading it. Miss Marple said, "The woodland sale." Agnes turned. She was not, Miss Marple noted with approval, a woman who wasted time on denials that would not hold. "Philip wanted to move on it in January," she said. 40 acres of the East Wood. There's a developer interested. It would clear the remaining mortgage on the hall and give us working capital for the first time in 8 years. She closed the folder. Dorothea would not have allowed it. The wood has been Calverton land since 1887, and she considered that the end of the matter. But she had not yet formally prevented it. She hadn't needed to formally prevent it, Agnes said. She had simply said no, and Philip had, as he always did, not quite been able to go further. She returned the folder to the cabinet with the care of someone who has decided to be precise. "I want you to understand that we did not, that Philip did not." "I don't think Philip did anything," Miss Marple said. "I am simply trying to understand the shape of things." Agnes looked at her steadily. "What shape are you finding?" Miss Marple considered this, genuinely, not as performance. "A complicated one," she said. "More complicated than it appears." She looked at the filing cabinet, the ordered folders, the household's administrative geometry. "Mrs. Calverton, Agnes, did Harriet Voss at any point yesterday speak to you about her mother? About Eleanor?" Agnes thought. "Once, briefly, at the gathering. She said she thought her mother would have liked the house." She paused. "She said it as though her mother were dead." "Her mother is dead," Miss Marple said. "She died in 2019. Agnes absorbed this. "I didn't know." "No," Miss Marple said. "I don't think very many people did." She thanked Agnes and collected Constance from the kitchen, where Constance had been sitting with Ruth in the companionable, practical way of a woman who understood that some forms of comfort require no words, and some require a second cup of tea. Ruth had not spoken much. Her cold tea had been replaced with a hot one and then allowed to go cold again. At the door, Croft intercepted them. He said to Constance, with the brisk courtesy of a man who has formed his view and is confident in it, that he would need to speak with Ruth Callow again tomorrow morning, and that she should not, in the meantime, make any plans to leave the hall. Constance said she was sure Ruth understood. Ruth, visible in the kitchen passage, was holding her cloth in both hands. She had heard. Her face arranged itself into the expression that Miss Marple had been observing since the previous morning. The expression of a person navigating guilt who is not guilty of the thing they are suspected of and cannot explain themselves without confessing to the other thing. The smaller thing, the thing that has sat behind her eyes for 9 years. On the walk back down the drive, Constance said, "He thinks it's Ruth." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Is he right?" The frost was entirely gone now. The gravel was dark and damp underfoot, and the bare hedges dripped in the still air. Miss Marple walked without hurrying, and thought about a woman who had washed the same bowl twice, and a pause before the word significantly, and a person who had offered to be useful and had found kitchens grounding, and a cream that was not stiff enough to mask the sherry. "No," she said, "he is not right." "Then who?" "I don't yet know," said Miss Marple, which was not entirely true. She knew the shape of it. She did not yet know all the pieces inside the shape. "I need to find out about Eleanor Voss," she said. "What her life was, what her last years were." Constance looked at her. "You think this is about Eleanor?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that nearly everything is about something that happened a long time ago. The difficulty is that it takes time to see how long ago." They went inside, and Constance put the kettle on, and Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table and thought about patience, about what it meant to wait, not because you were uncertain, but because the moment had not yet come. About a woman across a room watching cream being spooned into a bowl she had been thinking about for a very long time. Edwin Voss had said it with admiration. When she decides something is going to happen, it happens. Miss Marple folded her hands on the table. It had happened. The question now was how long ago she had decided. The solicitor's letter was from a firm in Cheltenham called Bryce, Alderton and Lamb, and Harriet Voss showed it to Miss Marple on the morning of the 27th without being asked. This was itself interesting. Miss Marple had gone to the hall at 10. Constance had her own reason for going. A conversation with Agnes about the practical matter of Dorothea's personal effects, and had found Harriet in the conservatory, sitting in one of the wicker chairs with a cup of coffee and the legal pad, writing. She had looked up when Miss Marple appeared in the doorway and said, without preamble, "I imagine you'd like to see this." The conservatory was cold. It ran along the south side of the hall, glass-roofed and glass-walled, and in summer it would have been pleasant, full of light and the smell of whatever Dorothea had grown in it. But in late December it was simply glass and iron and the grey sky pressing down from above, and it had the quality of a room that was waiting for a season that had not yet arrived. 2 large terracotta pots stood empty near the door. A third held a dead oleander, still upright in its dry soil, still holding its shape. Miss Marple sat in the other wicker chair and read the letter. It was from a Mr. Alderton, dated the 14th of December. It concerned a codicil to the will of Gerald Arthur Calverton, executed in February of 1987, which had conveyed certain benefits to Eleanor Ruth Voss, née Calverton, specifically in relation to a property known as Witchwood Cottage, which had been the childhood home of both Eleanor and Dorothea. The codicil had been, at Gerald's death, set aside on the grounds that the property had been disposed of prior to his death, and therefore the bequest was void. Mr. Alderton's letter suggested that new information had come to light regarding the circumstances of that disposal, and that there might be grounds for a challenge, should Miss Harriet Voss wish to pursue it as her mother's heir. Miss Marple read it twice and handed it back. "Your mother's home," she said. "Her parents' home," Harriet said, "which Dorothea and Gerald acquired in 1984 when my grandparents died, through a mechanism that Mr. Alderton describes as legally valid, and Eleanor always described as something else. She set the letter on the legal pad. My mother grew up in that house. She wanted it. Gerald promised her, informally and unwisely, given what informally means in law, that she would have the use of it. Then she and Dorothea fell out in 1986, and the codicil was written in 1987, and Gerald died in 1991, and the codicil was found to be void, and the house was sold in 1994. She looked at the dead oleander. My mother lived in a flat in Cheltenham for the last 22 years of her life. She died in it. And you came here, Miss Marple said, to— What? Present the letter to Dorothea? I came to see her face when she read it, Harriet said. She said it without drama, as a statement of plain fact. I wanted her to know that it wasn't over, that Eleanor had an heir who had read everything and retained a solicitor, and was not going to simply allow it to be finished. And had you seen her face? I arrived on the 23rd, Harriet said. I gave her the letter on the 24th. She read it at her desk in the study, and then she looked at me and said she was sorry for everything Eleanor had experienced, and that she would have her solicitors review the matter in the new year. A pause. She said it as though she were accepting a complaint form. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. The cold of the conservatory pressed in from the glass above. Outside, the bare garden lay stripped, and still the old herbaceous borders cut back to nothing, the structure of things visible without its summer cover. The paths, the beds, the framework of an order that would reconstitute itself in spring, but was now simply bones. The challenge itself, Miss Marple said. Would it succeed? Harriet looked at her with something that might in a different register have been amusement. Mr. Alderton thinks there is a reasonable case. Whether a reasonable case becomes a successful one in the hands of the Calverton family solicitors is a different question. They have been managing Calverton affairs for 40 years. She picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, set it down again. My mother didn't have money for solicitors. I do. That's the entire difference. Miss Marple considered this. It was, taken as a whole, a persuasive architecture of motive. A woman with a legitimate grievance, a long family wrong, a new legal avenue, and a victim who had received the challenge with bureaucratic serenity, rather than any apparent remorse. The woodland sale gave Philip and Agnes a reason. The codicil challenge gave Harriet a reason. Ruth's access gave the inspector a reason. The house, at this moment, full of reasons. And yet, Miss Marple had spent a long life noticing the difference between a reason to want someone dead and a reason to kill them. They were not the same thing. Most people who had compelling reasons to want someone dead did not kill them. They lived with the want. They managed it. They sublimated it into other channels. They arrived eventually at a version of acceptance that was not peace, but was at least livable. The particular additional step from wanting to doing required something more than reason. It required a specific internal configuration. A person who had reached a point at which the ordinary channels had not merely failed but had become, in some fundamental way, intolerable. She looked at Harriet Voss, who was looking at the dead oleander with an expression of perfect composure. She thought, "The letter. The letter is the visible motive, and it has been made visible deliberately, not in the manner of a person trying to distract. In the manner of a person who has decided that transparency about this particular thing is the correct posture. Who has thought about what posture is correct and adopted it?" she thought. But if the letter were the real motive, Dorothea needed to be alive. A live Dorothea facing a solicitor's challenge was a far more satisfying outcome than a dead Dorothea who could not be confronted, could not be made to account for herself, could not be seen reading the letter and arranging her face into carefully managed regret. The challenge required an opponent. Unless Miss Marple thought, the challenge was not the point. Unless the challenge was the reason for coming, and the coming was the reason for everything else. She filed this thought and returned to Harriet. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "your mother, in her last years, was she comfortable?" Harriet's composure did not alter. Something behind it did, briefly, and then it was gone. "She was not comfortable," she said. "She managed. She was not a woman who complained." She looked at her hands. "She was cold a good deal the last 2 winters. The flat had inadequate heating, and she was too proud to tell me the extent of it until I visited and could see for myself." "Did she have contact with Mrs. Calverton in those years?" "She wrote twice," Harriet said, "in 2016 and again in 2018. The second time she was in some financial difficulty, a temporary difficulty. It resolved itself, but she wrote." She picked up the legal pad and aligned it with the arm of the chair, a precise, unnecessary adjustment. Dorothea replied to both letters. The replies were very kind in their language. But the language," Harriet said, "was all there was." Miss Marple was quiet. She spent the rest of the morning in a way that would have appeared, to an observer, like the gentle, aimless movement of an elderly visitor with time on her hands. She accepted Agnes's offer of coffee in the kitchen. She exchanged a few words with Philip in the hall about the history of the estate, asking questions that allowed him to talk, which men like Philip invariably preferred to the alternative. She found in the course of this that Philip had expected his mother to formally refuse the woodland sale in the first week of January. He had asked her again at the beginning of December, and she had said she would consider it further, which both of them understood to mean no, but which had not yet become no on paper. He said this with the careful phrasing of a man who had been told, probably by Agnes, not to say too much, and who was finding the constraint effortful. "It would have made a significant difference," he said, "to the estate, to our position." He looked at the window. "I want you to understand that I'm not, that it isn't. Estates are very demanding," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "My nephew had some involvement with property management for a period and found it enormously complicated." Philip looked at her with the relief of a man who has been offered an exit from a sentence he had not known how to finish. "Exactly," he said. "Exactly that." She found Agnes afterward and asked whether Dorothea had ever spoken about Eleanor in the years Agnes had been at the Hall. Agnes said once, to her knowledge, at Christmas 4 years ago, when a card had arrived from a Cheltenham address and Dorothea had held it for a long moment before putting it with the others on the mantelpiece without opening it. She didn't open it, Miss Marple said. Not that day, Agnes said. I don't know about afterward. Miss Marple walked back to the conservatory after lunch, which she had spent with Constance in the cottage, and stood in it alone for a few minutes. The cold was considerable. The dead oleander stood in its pot. Through the glass she could see the bare garden, the stripped beds, the bones of the herbaceous border. She thought about Philip's not quite refusal, and Agnes's careful silences, and the woodland sale, and the codicil, and the letter that Harriet had shown her with the promptness of someone who had decided that transparency was the correct posture. She thought about Eleanor's letters to Dorothea, kind in their language, and the card from Cheltenham that had not been opened. She thought, there is a shape here, and I am standing in the wrong position to see it. The motive I can see most clearly is not the motive I am looking for, because the motive I am looking for would not be visible from this position. It would be visible only from inside something. Inside a specific experience, a specific relationship, a specific kind of loss that has no legal remedy, and no formal channel and no outcome except the one that has occurred. She thought about what Constance had said about Eleanor's garden, tall plants, things that need time and attention. She thought about monkshood, which is tall and beautiful, and which contains in its roots a substance that the old herbalists called wolfsbane, and which modern pharmacologists call aconitine, and which has been used as a poison since before the Romans thought to write it down. She stood in the cold conservatory and felt the wrong track solidify beneath her like ice that has been walked on once too often. Then she went to find Constance because she needed to make a telephone call to an acquaintance in Cheltenham, and she did not want to make it from the hall. The acquaintance in Cheltenham was a Mrs. Doris Polson, formerly of St. Mary Mead, who had moved to Cheltenham upon her second marriage in 1987, and had remained there through her second widowhood with the same practical equanimity she had brought to everything else. She knew everyone in Cheltenham who was worth knowing, and a good many people who were not, and she had the particular gift of the long-term resident, which is the ability to locate, within 3 telephone calls, anyone who had lived in a given street at a given time, and could speak to what things had been like there. Miss Marple telephoned her from the cottage at 2 o'clock, while Constance tactfully found reasons to be in the garden despite the cold. Mrs. Polson required 4 minutes of preliminary conversation about Christmas, and the state of her hip, and the extraordinary behavior of her neighbor's dog, before she could be brought to the matter in hand, which Miss Marple navigated with the patience of long practice. Then she asked her question. A woman named Eleanor Voss, latterly of a flat in Cheltenham, died 2019. What could Doris tell her? There was a brief pause while Mrs. Polson reorganized her considerable mental filing system. Voss, she said. Eleanor Voss. Yes, Beechcroft Road. Number 14, the upper flat. I didn't know her well. She wasn't a woman who knew people easily, if you understand me. But I knew of her. My friend Margaret Arbuthnot was on the same street, and they used to exchange a word or two over the years. What was she like? Private, Mrs. Polson said. Very private. The sort of person who has come down in the world and carries it quietly, which takes more strength than most people appreciate. She'd had a garden once, apparently, somewhere in the country, and she missed it terribly. She used to keep plants on the windowsill, Margaret said. Managed quite a lot of them in a small space. She had a daughter who visited regularly. A sensible, attentive sort of daughter. Was she comfortable? In a practical sense? Another pause. Margaret felt she was careful with money. More careful than she should have needed to be, was the impression. The heating in those upper flats on Beechcroft is not reliable. It's a Victorian conversion, and the landlord was not attentive. Margaret brought her meals twice during the cold snap in January 2018. Eleanor accepted them without making it easy, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple took her meaning precisely. Did she speak about her family? She spoke about her daughter. About the daughter's garden. She was proud of it, apparently. She spoke about her own family's house, the one she'd grown up in. Margaret had the impression that there was some history there, some unresolved matter, but Eleanor didn't elaborate, and Margaret wasn't the sort to press. A brief pause. She did say once, Margaret told me this sometime after Eleanor died, that she had written to her sister twice, and that her sister had replied, and that the replies had been beautifully written and had meant nothing at all. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. When did she die? March 2019. Her heart, in the end, though Margaret always felt the cold winters hadn't helped. She was 67. Mrs. Paulson's voice shifted slightly, taking on the particular quality it reserved for things that warranted genuine feeling. She was found by the woman downstairs who'd noticed the milk. 3 days, I believe. Harriet was in New Zealand with her husband. A work trip. No one's fault. These things happen. But she came back to an empty flat and a mother who'd been gone 3 days. And that, Mrs. Paulson said, with the simple authority of a woman who has lived long enough to know what things cost, is not something that leaves a person. Miss Marple thanked her, exchanged the necessary 2 minutes of closing conversation, and replaced the receiver. She sat at the cottage telephone table for a while without moving. 3 days, an empty flat. A daughter who had visited regularly, who was attentive, who had come back from New Zealand to find her mother had been gone 3 days, who had then gone through her mother's papers and found the letters from Dorothea, beautifully written, meaning nothing at all, and had begun from that point to think clearly about what she wanted to do. Not immediately, not in grief. Later, when the grief had settled into something harder and more specific, and she had read everything, and she had understood the shape of what had been done, not maliciously, not with deliberate cruelty, but with the particular cold efficiency of a woman who arranged things and who had arranged, over 30 years, for Eleanor to be continuously and smoothly excluded from everything that might have helped her. Miss Marple thought about Dorothea Calverton receiving guests in her entrance hall with the ease of a woman who had never had occasion to wonder whether she belonged where she was. She thought about Eleanor Voss on Beechcroft Road, keeping plants on the windowsill of an upper flat with inadequate heating, visited by a neighbor with meals during the cold snap, found after 3 days by the woman downstairs. She thought about the distance between those 2 lives, and the single relationship that connected them, and what it would mean to be the daughter who came back from New Zealand, and held those 2 pictures simultaneously and understood, with complete clarity, that one of them had made the other possible. She put on her coat and went out to find Constance in the garden. Constance was doing something with the dead stalks along the back fence that probably did not need doing in December, but which gave her hands occupation and her presence in the garden a practical justification. She looked up when Miss Marple appeared. "Done," she said. "Nearly," said Miss Marple. She stood on the path and looked at the garden, which was bare and frost-damaged and stripped to its structure, and saw what she should have been looking for since Constance had first mentioned it, because it had been there from the beginning, as obvious as a thing can be when you are finally standing in the right position to see it. Along the back fence, among the dead stalks of the summer's planting, several tall stems still stood, black and brittle in the winter air, their seed heads gone but their general architecture intact. The height, the hollow stems, the particular configuration of a plant that had been substantial in its season. Constance, Miss Marple said, what did you grow along the back there? Constance looked. Delphiniums mostly, some phlox. And there, she indicated a cluster of the taller black stalks at the far end. That's monkshood. It comes back every year. I've had it 15 years. Does Harriet grow it? Constance considered. I'd imagine so. She grows everything her mother grew. You said as much yourself. Eleanor was the one who introduced me to it, actually, years ago. Said it was the most architectural thing in the border. She looked at the stalks. You have to be careful with the roots. The sap can irritate if you're not wearing gloves, and the roots themselves are. She stopped. She looked at Miss Marple. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. The roots. They stood in the winter garden for a moment, the bare stalks around them, the cold air very still. Jane, Constance said. She had used the Christian name perhaps 3 times in 11 years. Are you certain? Not entirely, Miss Marple said. I need one more thing. I need to know what Harriet asked Doctor. Featherstone at the party. She looked at the monk's hood, its dead stems holding their shape in the cold. I meant to ask him and I forgot. That was careless of me. I could telephone him, Constance offered. I think I should go to him, Miss Marple said. It is the sort of question that wants to be asked in person. They went inside, and Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table while Constance made tea, and she thought about Eleanor Voss keeping plants on a windowsill in Beechcroft Road, and a daughter who grew everything her mother had grown, and monkshood that comes back every year and requires, if you know what you are doing, careful attention to the roots. She thought about patience. Not the patience of waiting without purpose, but the patience of a person who has a purpose so clearly defined that waiting feels not like endurance but like preparation. Every day a day closer to the moment when the conditions are exactly right, when the timing cannot be improved upon, when 31 years of trifle have made the method so obvious that the only question remaining is the date. Christmas. Of course Christmas. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was the moment of longest contrast. Dorothea at her most herself, presiding over her gathering with her silver stand and her 31 years of ritual and her belonging that had never required effort, and Eleanor's absence most completely felt, the flat on Beechcroft Road most completely cold, the 3 days most completely counted. Miss Marple accepted her cup of tea. She thought about Harriet in the conservatory that morning, showing her the letter with the promptness of a woman who had decided transparency was the correct posture. She had been right tactically. The letter had occupied Miss Marple for the better part of a day, had provided a legible motive, a legal framework, a reason for presence that was entirely genuine and entirely beside the point. A woman intelligent enough to use her real grievance as a screen for her real reason, knowing that the grievance would draw the eye and the reason would remain behind it in the dark. Not misdirection, just arrangement. The same quality Dorothea had used all those years to manage outcomes while appearing merely to respond to circumstances. There was, Miss Marple thought, a terrible irony in that which she suspected Harriet had considered, and which had not, in the end, stopped her. She looked at the window. The afternoon was going early, the light already thinning at 3:30. The sky, the flat pewter of a January dusk, arrived a week early. She thought, Ruth Callow will be arrested tomorrow morning. Croft had as much as said so. Ruth, who had borrowed £200 9 years ago, and returned it within the month, and had been carrying the weight of it ever since, who had grieved Dorothea with the exhausted authenticity of someone who had served devotedly and been seen as furniture, and who had made peace with it, and was now discovering the cost of that peace. Ruth, who had paused before the word significantly, and who had looked at the cloth in her hands when Croft said she should not make plans to leave. Miss Marple set down her cup. Tomorrow morning. That gave her this afternoon and this evening, and Dr. Featherstone, and one more piece. She put on her coat again. "You've only just sat down," Constance said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I know. I'm afraid I have been sitting down for slightly too long already." She went out into the thinning afternoon, her footsteps on the path quiet and deliberate, and walked toward the village and Dr. Featherstone's house, and thought about a 45-second conversation at a Christmas party that she had meant to ask about and had not, and which was now the last thing standing between where she was and where she needed to be. Dr. Featherstone lived in a stone house on the village's eastern edge, set back from the lane behind a privet hedge that had been allowed to grow slightly beyond what was strictly tidy, giving the property the look of a place whose owner had other things on his mind. A brass plate by the door said M. Featherstone, M.B.Ch.B. in the manner of a plate that had been there long enough to become invisible to its owner. Miss Marple rang the bell and waited. He answered the door himself, which meant the surgery was closed for the holiday, and Mrs. whatever her name was who managed his appointments had gone home to her family. He was in his shirt sleeves with a glass of whiskey that he had clearly not expected to be seen holding, and his face, without the controlled professional surface he had maintained through the gathering and the subsequent days, was simply tired. The particular tiredness of a man who has been holding something together by effort and has recently run out of reasons to continue the effort. "Miss Marple," he said, without surprise. People rarely surprised him, she suspected. Doctors who had been in practice for 23 years in the same village developed a familiarity with the range of things that could arrive at their door. "I am sorry to call without warning," she said. "I wonder if I might have 10 minutes." He considered her for a moment and then stood aside. The sitting room was a room in which a great deal of reading had been done over a long period. Books on every surface. The shelves long since overflowed onto the tables and the floor in the organized way of someone who knows exactly where everything is, and therefore sees no reason to impose a more conventional order. A fire was going. The whiskey glass found its way to the mantelpiece, and Featherstone sat in the chair opposite Miss Marple's, with the posture of a man who has decided to be cooperative, and is finding the decision costs him something. "You were fond of her," Miss Marple said. It was not a question, and she did not frame it as one. Featherstone looked at the fire for a moment. "She was my patient for 23 years, he said. Yes, I was fond of her." He picked up the whiskey glass and set it down again without drinking. "I knew she had a cardiac history. Not severe, not the kind of history that made last Thursday's outcome predictable, or I would have said so long before this, but a history. When she went down, I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was what it looked like." "Of course you did," Miss Marple said. "It was designed to look like what it looked like." Featherstone absorbed this in the manner of a man absorbing something he has already half absorbed but had hoped would not be confirmed. "The aconitine," he said. "Yes, in retrospect, the presentation had features. I've been going over it. The peripheral symptoms I noted and attributed to the cardiac event itself. There was tingling," she said before she went down. "I noted it." He looked at his hands. "I noted it, and I assigned it to the wrong column." "You could not have known," Miss Marple said. "That is precisely why it was chosen." He looked at her sharply. "You know who?" "I am nearly certain," Miss Marple said. "I need you to tell me about a conversation you had at the gathering. On Christmas night, before it happened. A woman came to speak to you briefly, after Dorothea moved away. You spoke for perhaps 45 seconds. I was across the room and could not hear. Featherstone was still. You noticed that. I noticed it, and I failed to ask you about it promptly," Miss Marple said. "That was an error on my part. I am asking now. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man deciding not how much to say but how to say what he has already decided to say. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Harriet Voss. She came to me at the party. I'd been speaking with Dorothea, and when Dorothea moved on, Harriet stepped in. Very smooth, very natural." He frowned at the word, as though reconsidering its accuracy. "She said she was writing a novel. A mystery novel," she said, "or thinking about writing one. It was casual, conversational. She said she'd been reading about historical poisoning cases and had come across references to aconitine and wondered whether a modern pathologist would identify it easily, or whether it might be missed." The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the lane was dark and quiet. "I told her," Featherstone said. He said it flatly, as a fact requires to be stated. "I told her it was identifiable but not always identified. That it depended on the pathologist, the circumstances, whether there was a specific reason to test for alkaloids. I said in a straightforward cardiac presentation it might well be missed." He looked at the fire. "She thanked me and moved on. I thought nothing of it. People ask doctors things at parties. It's one of the consistent features of the profession. Someone always wants to know about their symptoms, or their mother's prescription, or whether the thing they read on the internet has any merit." He picked up the whiskey glass. "I thought nothing of it." "You could not have been expected to," Miss Marple said. "She was asking me," Featherstone said, "how to get away with it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "she was being careful. She had been careful for a long time, I think. She wanted to know the margin, and you gave her a professional assessment of the margin, and she thanked you and filed it, and went back to the party and ate her trifle." Featherstone drank. He set the glass down with the precision of a man placing something where he knows it belongs. "What will you do?" "I need to speak with her before Croft does," Miss Marple said. "He intends to arrest Ruth Callow tomorrow morning. Ruth did not do it, and she will not be able to defend herself adequately without confessing to something else entirely, which is a separate matter, and which has caused her 9 years of unnecessary suffering already." Featherstone looked at her. There was, in his expression, the particular quality of a man who has just recalibrated his assessment of another person. Not dramatically, but permanently. "The borrowed money," he said. Miss Marple looked at him. "I know about it," he said. "Dorothea told me. Not as a grievance, as a fact. She said Ruth had borrowed from the household account and returned it, and that she had never mentioned it to Ruth, because there was nothing to be gained from it. She said Ruth had been carrying it visibly for years, and she had chosen not to relieve her of it because—" He stopped. "Because," Miss Marple said. Featherstone's jaw tightened slightly. "Because it was useful," he said, "to have Ruth slightly indebted, slightly off balance. It kept things. She said it kept things in their proper arrangement." The room was very quiet. Miss Marple looked at the fire. She thought about Dorothea Calverton, receiving guests with the ease of a woman who had never had occasion to wonder whether she belonged where she was, and about arrangements kept in their proper order, and about Eleanor's letters replied to in beautiful language that meant nothing at all. She thought about the distance between the picture the village had held of Dorothea and the picture that was emerging now, detail by detail, the way a winter garden reveals its structure when the growth is gone, not ugly, not monstrous, but true. A woman who arranged things, who had arranged with perfect smoothness for everyone in her orbit to remain precisely where she needed them. She wasn't a villain, Miss Marple said, half to herself. She was simply very skilled at a particular kind of management, and some of the things she managed were people who deserved better. "Yes," said Featherstone. He sounded exhausted. "I've been trying to hold those two things simultaneously since Thursday night. The woman I was fond of and the woman who kept Ruth Callow guilty on purpose." He looked at his hands. Harriet Voss knew her better than I did, perhaps. She knew the cost of her, Miss Marple said. That is not quite the same thing, but it is a kind of knowledge. She rose, straightening her coat. Will you tell Croft? Featherstone asked. I will speak with Mrs. Voss first, Miss Marple said. Tonight, if she is willing. Tomorrow, certainly, before Croft arrives. And if she denies it? Miss Marple considered this genuinely, not as a performance of consideration, but because it was a genuine question with a genuine answer. She won't, she said. I don't think she is a woman who denies things. I think she is a woman who has been entirely clear with herself about what she has done and why, and when she is faced with someone who has also been entirely clear, she will not see the purpose of denial. She moved toward the door. She may, however, want to be the one who chooses the moment and the manner of it. I think I can offer her that within limits. Featherstone came with her to the door. The lane outside was fully dark now, the village quiet in the way of a place that has absorbed something difficult and is taking its time with it. Miss Marple, he said at the door, the conversation about the novel. I've been wondering, do you think she had chosen Christmas before she came? Or did she decide when she got here? Miss Marple looked at the dark lane, the frost beginning to reform on the stone wall opposite, the village settling into its winter night. I think, she said, that she chose Christmas 3 years ago when she first decided. I think the specific Christmas, this one, was confirmed when she consulted Mr. Alderton in December. She needed a reason to be here that was not the real reason. The solicitor's letter gave her the visit. The visit gave her the gathering. The gathering gave her the trifle. She buttoned the top button of her coat against the cold. Everything was already in place. She simply needed to arrive. Featherstone nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting something he would have a great deal of time to think about. Thank you, Miss Marple said, for telling me. I know it wasn't easy. She asked me how to get away with it, he said again, more quietly, as though testing whether repetition would make it feel differently. And I told her. You told a woman at a party what any toxicology textbook would have told her, Miss Marple said firmly. You are not responsible for what she already knew. She walked out into the lane. The frost was reforming underfoot with the quiet efficiency of a process that does not require attention or permission. Above the village the sky was clear and very black and full of stars with the hard brightness of stars in cold air. Miss Marple walked without hurrying, her footsteps small and deliberate on the frozen lane, and she turned the whole thing over one final time. The cream, the garden, the letter shown with calculated transparency, the 45-second conversation, the bottle on the windowsill, Edwin's admiring observation, Eleanor on Beechcroft Road in January, the card from Cheltenham that had not been opened. It held. All of it held, piece fitted to piece, the whole structure sound she knew. The question now was Ruth Callow in the hall's kitchen, holding a cloth, waiting for morning. Croft would come at 9. It was now 5:30. She had the evening, and the cold, and Harriet Voss, who was a patient woman, and who would understand, Miss Marple thought, that patience had its proper limits. That there was a moment at which the composure one had maintained through an enormously long preparation met a different kind of composure, the composure of someone who had also been watching and waiting, and who had, in the end, arrived at the same position from a different direction. She turned up the drive toward the Hall. The conservatory light was on. A single figure was visible through the glass, sitting in the wicker chair, quite still, facing the dark garden. Harriet Voss, waiting, as she always waited, with the calm of a person who has decided what comes next, and is simply allowing the time between the decision and the moment to pass without resistance. Miss Marple looked at the figure in the glass and felt, not for the first time in her long experience of these matters, the complicated weight of knowing. The thing that was necessary and the thing it would cost held simultaneously, like two objects of different temperatures in the same hands. Then she went inside. The conservatory door was unlocked. Miss Marple let herself in without knocking, which was not strictly the done thing, but which was, she judged, appropriate to the occasion. Harriet looked up when she entered, not with surprise, and not with the performance of unsurprise, but with the simple acknowledgment of a woman who had been expecting someone and was noting that the someone had arrived. The cold in the conservatory was considerable. The single bulb above the wicker chairs gave a yellowish, insufficient light that made the glass walls into mirrors, reflecting the two women back at themselves against the darkness of the garden beyond. The dead oleander stood in its pot by the door. The empty terracotta urns cast long shadows across the tile floor. It was, Miss Marple thought, a room that had been designed for warmth and growth and was functioning this evening as neither. Harriet had the legal pad on her knee, but she was not writing. She set it on the side table when Miss Marple came in and did not look at it again. "Sit down, Miss Marple," she said. Miss Marple sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. This did not feel, as silences sometimes do, like an avoidance. It felt more like two people arriving at the same point by different routes and taking a moment to establish that they were, in fact, at the same point before proceeding. Outside the glass, the garden was entirely dark. The frost was completing itself on the stone paths, the bare beds, the dead structural stems of the border. "You've spoken to Featherstone," Harriet said. "Yes, and before that someone in Cheltenham." Miss Marple looked at her. "How did you know that?" "I didn't," Harriet said. "But it was the obvious move, and you don't strike me as a woman who fails to make the obvious move once she's identified it." She folded her hands in her lap with the composed precision that Miss Marple had observed in her since the first evening. The gesture of a woman who has learned to keep her hands still because her hands otherwise would give her away. "I knew someone would get there eventually. I thought it would take longer. I thought it would be the inspector." "Inspector Croft is a capable man," Miss Marple said. "He would have got there. Possibly not before Ruth Callow had spent some time in a cell, which seemed to me an avoidable outcome." Something moved briefly in Harriet's expression. Not guilt, exactly, and not indifference, but something in the territory between them. "I didn't intend Ruth to bear it," she said. "I intended it to look like what it was designed to look like. An elderly woman with a cardiac history, a kitchen, a trifle. I did not design it to point at anyone in particular." "No," Miss Marple said, "but circumstance pointed at Ruth, and you allowed it to." Harriet was quiet. "You could have corrected it," Miss Marple said, not accusingly, as a simple observation, in the way one notes a fact about a mechanism. "At any point in the last 2 days you could have redirected the inspector's attention. You did not." "No," Harriet said. "I didn't." She looked at the dark garden through the glass. "I told myself it would resolve, that the post-mortem would determine the cause, and then the question of Ruth's access would be weighed against the absence of motive, and it would resolve." A pause. "I was being tidy about my own position." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You were." She said it without softening it, and Harriet received it without flinching. This, Miss Marple thought, was the quality that had been present all along, behind the composure. Not coldness, but a particular kind of honesty that a person develops when they have spent a long time being clear with themselves about difficult things. Harriet Voss had not the face of a woman who deceived herself. Whatever she had done with her eyes entirely open, and she had not, in the aftermath, rewritten it into something more comfortable. "Your mother," Miss Marple said. Tell me about the last winter." Harriet looked at her. It was not the look of a woman who had been asked something unexpected. It was the look of a woman who had been waiting to be asked this specific thing and had not been sure anyone would ask it. "January 2018, she said. "I visited on the 14th. She had the heating on, but it wasn't. The boiler in those flats ran on a timer that the landlord controlled. From 8 in the morning until 11, and then again from 5 until 9 in the evening. Outside those hours, the flat was cold. She had an electric bar heater she ran in the sitting room in the afternoons. She said it was perfectly adequate." Harriet's voice remained level, and she kept it level with a visible, deliberate effort that was the first crack in the composure Miss Marple had seen since she sat down. There was ice on the inside of the bedroom window. She had put a draft excluder across the bottom of it. She'd made it herself from an old curtain. She showed it to me as though it were an accomplishment. Miss Marple said nothing. She had written to Dorothea 6 weeks before that visit, Harriet continued. The second letter. She did not tell me she had written it until I found the copy in her desk after she died. She had kept a copy of both letters and both replies in a folder in her desk, very organized, very like her. She paused. Dorothea's reply was 2 pages. It was a beautiful letter, full of warmth and expressed regret and measured sympathy. It said that the situation between the families was complicated, and that she hoped Eleanor understood that there were constraints that prevented Dorothea from acting as her heart might have wished. It said she would keep Eleanor in her thoughts. Harriet's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. My mother was cold in January 2018, and Dorothea Calverton kept her in her thoughts. The conservatory was very quiet. The cold pressed in from the glass on all sides. She died in March 2019, Harriet said. I was in New Zealand. A work trip Edwin had needed to make, and I had gone with him because we had not had a holiday in 3 years, and my mother said to go. She was perfectly fine. She was always perfectly fine. She stopped. Mrs. Paulson's friend brought her meals during a cold snap in February. My mother accepted them. She never told me. She was found on a Thursday. She had been gone since Monday. I know, Miss Marple said quietly. I came home and I went to the flat and I sat in it for a long time, Harriet said. And then I went through her things, and I found the folder. She looked at her hands, and I read Dorothea's letters, both of them. And I understood something that I had suspected but not fully understood before, which was that Dorothea was not a cruel woman, and had never been a cruel woman, and that this made it worse rather than better. A cruel woman is doing something she knows is wrong. Dorothea was doing what she did because she had arranged the world in her mind in such a way that her comfort and her position and her management of things was simply the natural order, and those who suffered at its edges suffered at a distance she had never once crossed to measure. She stopped. She looked at the dead oleander. It took me a long time, she said, to decide. I want you to understand that. It was not a quick decision, and it was not made in grief. I made it 18 months after she died, when I had read everything and thought about everything, and understood clearly what I was deciding and why. I am not, she paused, I am not a person who does things without understanding them. No, Miss Marple said, you are not. I grew the monkshood. I've grown it for 12 years. I knew the process. She said this with the flat precision of someone completing a set of facts that need to be stated. I consulted your doctor, Featherstone, at the party, because I wanted to know the specific margin. I knew the theory, but I wanted a practical assessment from someone who had seen cardiac presentations. He gave me one. He was being perfectly ordinary and professional and had no reason to be otherwise. The bottle on the window-sill, Miss Marple said. Valerian now, Harriet said. Since the 28th. The original is in the Cheltenham Municipal Drain. She said it without satisfaction and without apology. I bought the valerian at a health food shop. Edwin has never distinguished between one tincture and another. He thinks they are all equally improbable, which makes him equally incurious about all of them." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "You know that I am going to tell Inspector Croft." Harriet looked back. "Yes," she said, "I know that." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating but organizing. "Ruth Callow," she said. "He's coming at 9 tomorrow." "Yes, I'll speak to him myself," Harriet said. "Tonight, if he'll come, before 9. She looked at the legal pad on the side table. "I've been writing it out. What I'll say. I find it easier to be precise if I've written it first." Miss Marple looked at the legal pad and thought about all the things she had attributed to it during the past 2 days. Notes about the solicitor's letter, practical arrangements, the various administrative tasks of a woman managing a complicated visit. It had been this: a statement prepared with care and patience in the small, neat handwriting of a woman who found it easier to be precise if she had written it first. "May I ask you something?" Miss Marple said. Harriet inclined her head. "The letter. The solicitor's letter, the codicil challenge. Was any part of that real? Or was it purely the mechanism for being here?" Harriet considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. "Both," she said. "The wrong done to my mother was real. The legal avenue is real. Mr. Alderton believes the case has merit. I intend to pursue it, whatever happens now." She looked at the dark glass. "I wanted Dorothea to read it. I wanted her to know that it wasn't finished. I wanted to see her face." A pause. "I did see her face. She read it at her desk, and she looked at me and arranged her expression into careful regret and said she would have her solicitors review it in the new year." She was quiet for a moment. She was never going to be anything other than what she was. I knew that. I had always known that. It didn't change anything. "No," Miss Marple said. "I didn't think it would." She rose from the wicker chair, which required a moment of the effortful adjustment that December and cold and 74 years of living made necessary. Harriet did not offer her hand to help, which was the correct instinct. Miss Marple was not the kind of woman who welcomed the offer. She stood in the cold conservatory and looked at Harriet Voss, who looked back at her without flinching and without appeal. There was, between them, the complicated weight of the thing that had been said and the thing that would follow from it, not comfortable, not resolvable into any clean feeling, but present and real and requiring to be carried. "Your mother," Miss Marple said. "She would not have wanted this." Harriet received this. She took a long moment with it. "No," she said. "She would not. She was not. She was not that kind of woman. She was the kind of woman who carried things quietly and made curtain draft excluders and grew plants on window sills." She looked at her hands. "I am a different kind." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You are." She moved toward the conservatory door. Behind her she heard Harriet pick up the legal pad. "Miss Marple," Harriet said. She stopped. "Did you know?" Harriet said. "At the party? On Christmas night before it happened?" Miss Marple considered the question honestly, because it deserved honesty. "I knew something," she said. "I did not know what. I saw you look at the trifle, and I thought that you had been thinking about it for a very long time. I did not know then what the thinking had produced. But you watched me." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I watched." A pause. "I watched her, too," Harriet said quietly, "all evening. I had not expected it to be. I had not thought about what it would be like to watch her, to be in the same room." She stopped. She was very much herself. Right up until she wasn't. Miss Marple stood at the door with her hand on the cold iron handle. "I'll telephone Croft," she said. "He can come tonight. Will you be ready?" "I've been ready," Harriet said, "for quite some time." Miss Marple went out through the conservatory door into the cold night, and the door closed behind her with a sound that was very small and very final in the stillness. The frost was complete now across the garden, every surface sealed and still and glittering faintly in the light that came through the conservatory glass behind her. Harriet's silhouette visible in the wicker chair, the legal pad in her hands, already writing. Miss Marple did not look back. She walked across the frozen garden toward the drive, her footsteps leaving small, precise marks in the frost, and she thought about Eleanor Voss making a draft excluder from an old curtain in a cold flat in January. And she thought about Dorothea Calverton keeping Eleanor in her thoughts from the warmth of Whitbourne Hall, and she thought about the distance between those two things and the 30 years of it, and the daughter who had finally, in her own way and at her own cost, crossed it. She found the lane and turned toward the village and Dr. Featherstone's house, which was closer than the cottage, and had a telephone she could use. And she walked through the cold, bright dark without hurrying, because there was no longer any reason to hurry. And the frost held the garden in its complete and indifferent grip, and the stars above Whitbourne Ferrers were very clear and very cold and entirely unconcerned with any of it. Croft came at 8:30 that evening. Miss Marple had telephoned from Featherstone's house, and Croft had listened without interruption, which told her more about him than anything he had said during the preceding days. He was a man who, when presented with information that required him to revise a settled position, revised it in silence rather than in argument. She respected this. It was rarer than it should have been. He arrived at the hall with his constable and without the manner he had carried through the previous interviews, the contained energy of a man with a formed view. He had a different manner now, quieter and more careful, the manner of someone approaching a thing he has not encountered in quite this configuration before, and is taking the time to understand its shape before he acts. Harriet met him in the entrance hall. She had the legal pad. She handed it to him before he had said anything, which disconcerted the constable slightly, though Croft simply took it and read the first page standing in the hall under the light, and then he looked at Harriet and said they should go somewhere to sit down, and Harriet said yes, the study, and led him there without further ceremony. Edwin was in the sitting room. He had been told. Miss Marple did not know exactly what had passed between them in the hour between her leaving the conservatory and Croft's arrival, and she did not ask, and Harriet had not offered it. What she could see, passing the sitting-room door on her way to join Constance in the kitchen, was Edwin sitting in the chair by the window with his hands on his knees and the particular stillness of a man who has received something enormous and is holding it very carefully to prevent it from breaking further. He did not look up when she passed. She did not disturb him. Ruth Callow was in the kitchen. She had not been told why Croft had come tonight, rather than tomorrow morning, only that he had come, and that something had changed, and that she should stay in the kitchen and wait. Constance was with her. They were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table with tea between them, and Ruth's face had the look of a woman who has been told to wait so many times in the past 2 days that waiting has become a kind of permanent condition, and who is no longer certain what she is waiting for or what form the end of it will take. Miss Marple came in and sat down. Ruth looked at her. "It wasn't you," Miss Marple said. "The inspector knows it wasn't you. That is why he is here tonight." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the table. Her hands, which had spent 3 days worrying the cloth, were entirely still. Something was happening in her face that was not quite any single recognizable expression. It was the complicated rearrangement of a person who has been carrying a weight that has been removed without warning and is discovering that the absence of it is not the simple relief they had imagined it would be, because they have been carrying it for so long that it has become structural. "I borrowed," she said, "from the household account 9 years ago, £200. I put it back." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "I know." Ruth looked at her sharply. "How?" "I inferred it," Miss Marple said, "from the way you held yourself when the inspector was in the room. You were not frightened of being accused of what you hadn't done. You were frightened of being asked about what you had, and having the one become confused with the other." She paused, which is exactly what would have happened had things proceeded as they were proceeding. Ruth absorbed this. She knew, she said, it was not a question. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She knew." Ruth's jaw tightened. "She never said—" "No," Miss Marple said. "She didn't." A long silence. The kitchen held its warmth and its smell of the past several days, tea and toast, and the residue of a Christmas gathering that felt, now, very long ago. Outside the window the frost held the garden in its grip. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of voices, low and indistinct. Ruth said, "Did she keep it? Knowing it, and not saying?" Miss Marple considered the question with the care it deserved. "I believe," she said, "that she found it useful to have the matter unresolved, that it served a purpose." She said it as plainly as she could, because Ruth Callow had spent 22 years being managed by someone who arranged things, and she deserved, at the end of it, a plain account of what that had been. "I don't think she wished you ill. I think she simply found the arrangement convenient." Ruth was quiet for a long time. Constance poured more tea that nobody wanted and set the pot down quietly and looked at the window. 22 years, Ruth said. "I kept this house. I kept it properly. The gathering, 31 years she'd done it, and the last 22 were mine. The trifle. Everything." She stopped. "And she kept my £200 like a thing in her pocket." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "she did." "I grieved her," Ruth said. Not accusingly, not performing it, stating it, as one states a fact that has become complicated. "I genuinely grieved her." "I know," Miss Marple said. "That was visible. That was the thing that was most clearly true in this whole business." Ruth looked at her. For the first time in 3 days her eyes were not performing anything. Not innocence, not grief, not the effortful composure of a woman navigating guilt she didn't own. They were simply tired and clear, and looking at Miss Marple with the directness of someone who is done with carrying things in the wrong direction. "What happens now?" she said. "The inspector will have several things to attend to," Miss Marple said. "You will need to make a statement about what you saw, what you did, what you remember of Christmas afternoon. It will be straightforward." She paused. "The other matter, the £200, I think you will find that it does not need to be part of this. It is not relevant to what is being investigated." Ruth nodded slowly. "After that," Miss Marple said, "is rather up to you." Croft came to find Miss Marple at 10 o'clock after Harriet had been taken out to the car with a constable, and Edwin had been given the name of a solicitor, and the sitting-room had been left to its own devices. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man making a final assessment. "I'd like to know," he said, "how much of this you had on Christmas night?" "Very little," Miss Marple said honestly. "An impression. The sense of a person who had been thinking about something for a long time." "And you said nothing?" "I had nothing to say," she said. "An impression is not information. I needed several days and a number of conversations to arrive at information." Croft considered this, the conversation with Featherstone. "At the party. I noticed it. I failed to follow it up promptly. That was a mistake on my part." He looked at her steadily. "If you had followed it up on Boxing Day, Ruth Callow would not have spent 2 days carrying what she carried," Miss Marple said. "Yes, that is the cost of my mistake, and I am aware of it." Croft received this. He was a fair man, she thought, fair enough to accept a direct admission without pressing it further. "The bottle," he said. "The tincture bottle," she said. She replaced it on the 28th. "Yes, in Cheltenham. You will not find the original." "No." He looked at his notebook. 3 years of preparation. "At least," Miss Marple said. "Possibly from the time of her mother's death, which was March 2019. The active preparation, the extraction, the storage, perhaps 18 months before this Christmas. And she came here with a solicitor's letter as cover." "The letter was genuine," Miss Marple said. "The legal challenge is genuine, and she intends to pursue it. It served 2 purposes simultaneously, which is consistent with how she approached the whole matter." Croft closed his notebook. He looked at the kitchen, the clean surfaces, the silver trifle stand on the counter which Ruth had, finally, that afternoon, washed and put away. 31 years of Christmas gatherings, he said. She chose this one. She chose this one because she finally had a legitimate reason to be present, Miss Marple said. Without the solicitor's letter, she had no mechanism for attending the gathering. She could not have introduced herself into the household plausibly. The legal avenue gave her access and gave her motive that was visible and drew the eye. She paused. She is very intelligent. She used everything she had, including the truth. Croft nodded once, the nod of a man concluding a section of work. He said good night and went out through the hall, and presently Miss Marple heard the car on the drive. And then the drive was quiet. Philip Calverton put the Woodland sale through in March, after a period of legal uncertainty, during which 2 separate firms of solicitors exchanged letters with the careful formality of people billing by the hour. The 40 acres of East Wood became, by November, the foundations of 14 detached houses with what the developer's brochure described as a semi-rural outlook. Agnes managed the process with the competence that turned out to be her natural register, and Philip found that the financial relief was genuine, and that the guilt attached to it was manageable and diminished month by month, which is the way guilt usually behaves when it is not regularly examined. Ruth Callow left the hall in February. She gave no forwarding address to the village, though Constance received a postcard in April from Dorset, a coastal view, 4 lines in Ruth's handwriting, saying she had found a position with a family in Lyme Regis who required someone to manage a large household, and that the sea air was considerable, and that she was, the word underlined once. Well, Constance read the postcard to Miss Marple on the telephone and said she was glad, and Miss Marple said she was glad too and meant it. Dr. Featherstone retired in April. He told his patients it was time, and told Constance, when she asked, that he had found the winter difficult to recover from. He moved to Edinburgh, which he had always considered home, and had never quite returned to, and whether the return made him happy was something that Constance did not know, and Miss Marple suspected was too early to determine. Harriet Voss was charged in January. The case, when it came to court in September, was covered in the national papers with the particular intensity that the papers reserve for crimes that are domestically comprehensible, not random, not monstrous, but rooted in relationships and history, and the kind of accumulated grievance that readers could uncomfortably follow. The coverage described Harriet as composed throughout, which was accurate. Edwin sat behind her every day of the trial. Whether this was love or loyalty, or the performance of loyalty that becomes love through performance, was not something the papers considered, and was not, Miss Marple thought, something that had a clean answer. The codicil challenge was suspended pending the criminal proceedings. Harriet's solicitor indicated it would be resumed. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead on the 29th of December, having stayed 2 days longer than planned. which Constance received as a gift without naming it as such. The train from Whitbourne Ferrers Halt was on time, which felt, after everything, faintly anticlimactic. She sat in the carriage and watched the Oxfordshire countryside move past the window. Frost still on the fields, the sky the same pale pewter it had been for a week, bare hedges and pale light, and the bones of things visible without their cover. She thought about Dorothea Calverton, whom the village would go on speaking of as a great lady, because the village had known her for 30 years. And what you have known for 30 years does not revise easily, even when revision is warranted. She thought that this was not entirely wrong. Dorothea had been, in many ways, exactly what the village believed. The thing that was also true about her did not cancel the thing they knew. It simply occupied the same space, which was uncomfortable, and which was, in Miss Marple's experience, the usual condition of things. She thought about Eleanor Voss growing plants on a window-sill in Cheltenham, keeping her mother's garden alive in the only space available to her, and about Harriet growing everything Eleanor had grown in her own garden, in a way that was now comprehensible as something more than horticulture, a form of fidelity, a way of keeping a person present, a long tending of something that should not be allowed to die. She thought about the monkshood, its roots and what they contained, and what it meant that the same plant could be both the tending and the ending, could be grown for 12 years in faithful continuation of a mother's garden, and also be the instrument of the decision made 18 months after that mother was found after 3 days in a cold flat in March. She did not think these things resolved into anything comfortable. She did not expect them to. At Oxford a woman got on with 2 children and a great deal of luggage, and the carriage filled with the noise and movement of ordinary life resuming itself, and Miss Marple moved her bag from the seat beside her and made room, and looked out of the window at the passing countryside, and thought about the one thing she had not resolved and did not expect to, the card from Cheltenham. The Christmas card that Dorothea had held for a long moment, and then placed on the mantelpiece with the others, unopened. Eleanor's last card to her sister, sent the December before she died. Miss Marple had worked out the timing and was certain enough of it. Delivered and received and held and placed and never opened. She did not know what was in it. She did not know whether it was a final appeal, another request, a simple seasonal greeting maintained out of habit, or something else entirely, some last attempt at the thing that had been lost 30 years before, some reaching across the distance that Dorothea had finally, by not opening it, declined for the last time. She would never know. Nobody would know now, because nobody had opened it, and it was gone with the house clearance or the fire or the ordinary disposal of a dead woman's accumulated paper. And whatever Eleanor had written to her sister that last December was as private and as finished as Eleanor herself. Miss Marple looked at the pale winter fields. It was possible, she thought, that the card had contained nothing significant, that it had been a simple seasonal greeting, and that she was investing it with a weight it did not carry. It was also possible that it had been the thing which, read, might have changed something. She did not know which. She found that she could hold not knowing with the equanimity of a woman who had held not knowing many times before, and who had learned that the unanswered questions were not the failure of a thing but the proof of it. Proof that the situation had been real and human and resistant to the neat resolution that only fiction honestly promised and life consistently declined to provide. The train moved through the pale countryside. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and looked out of the window, and the frosts held the fields on either side, and Whitbourne Ferrers fell away behind her, and she went home. Epilogue Saint. Mary Mead received her back without ceremony, which was exactly what she wanted. The taxi from the station turned into the familiar lane at 4:30, and the village was doing what it always did at that hour in late December. Closing itself against the early dark, lights coming on in windows, the post office already shut, the vicar's car outside the church hall indicating some meeting or other that would be discussed with varying degrees of accuracy at various breakfast tables tomorrow morning. Miss Marple looked at it all through the taxi window with the feeling she always had on returning, which was not quite relief and not quite love, but something that partook of both. The particular comfort of a place that had been known so long that knowing it had become indistinguishable from being known by it. Her own cottage was cold, as it always was after an absence, and she moved through the familiar business of return. The heating, the kettle, the small accumulation of post that her neighbor misses. Hartley had collected and placed on the hall table with the addition of a note saying the garden gate latch had been sticking and had been seen to. Miss Marple read this note with genuine gratitude and made a mental note to bring Mrs. Hartley something from the village shop in the morning. She made her tea and took it to the sitting room and sat in her usual chair by the window and looked at the familiar garden in the last of the light, and she allowed herself, for the first time since Christmas night, to be simply tired. It was a clean tiredness, mostly. The kind that comes after a thing has been seen through to its proper end. Not comfortable, because the end had not been comfortable, but complete. There was a difference between a thing that had been resolved and a thing that had been finished, and she had learned, over a long life, not to confuse them. What had happened in Whitburn Ferrers was finished. It was not, and would not be, resolved. She thought about Harriet in the police car, the constable who had not known what to do. She thought about Edwin's hands on his knees in the sitting room at the Hall. She thought about Ruth Callow holding a cloth for the last time in Dorothea Calverton's kitchen, and about what it meant to grieve someone who had kept your guilt in their pocket like a useful thing, and whether grief of that particular kind had a name, or whether it was simply one of the many experiences that language had not yet caught up with. She thought, as she had thought on the train, about the unopened card. She had, she decided, been right not to mention it to anyone in Whitburn Ferrers. It belonged to the category of things that could not be used, that had no bearing on what had happened, and no capacity to alter what would follow, and that served no purpose except to be felt. She had felt it, and she would go on feeling it in the quiet way that such things persist, not urgently, but present, like a draught under a door that has been there long enough to seem like a feature of the room. Outside the window the garden went dark by degrees. The last light left the sky in the particular way it does in late December, not dramatically, but with the quiet thoroughness of a thing that has been doing this for a very long time, and sees no need to make more of it than it is. She thought about Eleanor Voss, as she expected she would go on thinking about Eleanor Voss for some time. Not with guilt. There was nothing in this that was hers to feel guilty about, but with the specific weight of a woman who had spent a long life looking at the cost that people pay for being peripheral to someone else's arrangements. Eleanor had been peripheral to Dorothea's arrangement of the world for 30 years. She had kept her windowsill garden and written her careful letters, and made her curtain draft excluda, and been cold in January, and been found after 3 days, and had left in a folder in a desk the documentary record of what it had meant to be Eleanor Voss. Harriet had read that folder. Miss Marple thought, what would I have done? She sat with the question honestly, in the way she sat with difficult things. Not rushing to an answer, not performing the reaching for an answer, simply sitting with the question and allowing it to be the size it actually was. She did not know. That was the honest answer. She was 74 years old, and she had seen a great deal, and she had learned, among the many things a long life teaches, that there is a category of human action that exists beyond the reach of the judgments she was competent to make. She could see clearly what Harriet had done. She could see clearly what it had cost, and what it had come from, and what the long arithmetic of it had been. She could not, sitting in her chair in the winter dark of St. Mary Mead, say with any confidence that she knew what the right answer was, because the right answer existed somewhere in the space between Eleanor cold in January and Dorothea warm at the center of her 31st gathering, and that space was not a space that the right answer could comfortably occupy. She had done what needed to be done. Ruth was not in a cell. Croft had his case. The constable had not known what to do in the car. It was enough. It had to be enough. She finished her tea. She sat for a while longer in the dark without turning the lamp on, which was the kind of thing you could do in your own house, in your own village, at the end of a long and difficult week, without explanation or apology. The familiar shapes of the familiar room settled around her. Through the window the garden was invisible now, fully given over to the December dark, and she could see only the faint reflection of herself in the glass. A small, still figure in a chair, looking out. After a while she turned the lamp on. There was, after all, tomorrow morning and Mrs. Hartley's gate latch, and the village shop, and the ordinary resumed fabric of a life that was, on balance, a very good one, and which asked of her only that she continue to live it with the same attention she had always brought to it. She would. She reached for the small stack of post from the hall table and began to go through it, and the lamp made a warm circle in the window of the cottage, and outside St. Mary Mead went quietly about its winter evening, and Miss Marple went home.